Today, we're going to be talking about the Excel spreadsheet importer, kind of focusing on some of the things that we typically see from support cases as they come through, hitting on some of those things that we see are common things that people run into using that. And so we're kind of going to go through three different things with this. First one's just going to be setting up the Excel macro file, kind of what is involved with that setup and what goes into that. Then understanding some of the potential errors that you might run into, some of the more common ones. I'm not going to run through every single one because it varies from machine to machine. But I'll talk about the more common ones that you may run into and kind of how to address some of those. In the last step, we'll kind of go through some sample imports, and I'll talk about the various tables you can import to, and what the required fields are, and what tables rely on other tables that already have data present. So you may have run into that before. So we'll go through some of those examples here as we go through. So the first thing is going to be setting up your Excel macro file. The macro file that we have is something called the gxdb.xla file. If you're kind of new to GeoGraphix and the first time you try to go and import a spreadsheet, it tells you might be missing that file. It is something that we provide through our downloads. It is found in the utilities download folder. Each version of GeoGraphix has its own utilities folder. And in those utilities, there is a folder for the spreadsheet importer files. So you can find that file, and then you just need to move it into the correct folder, which we'll kind of show it here in just a second. And you want to make sure that you grab the version of that file that matches the version you are currently on. If you've recently updated to 2019.2, then go and download the utilities file folder for 2019.2, and there will be a macro file in there for that version. Also check the Excel version you have installed on your machine. You can find this through Excel if you go to File, Account, and then About Excel. It'll give you the version and then some part numbers there, and then whether it's 64 or 32-bit. Then we kind of use that information for troubleshooting purposes. If we find that the macro file is not working, you can just double check to make sure you have the correct version of that. On the folder path for where this file is located, it's going to vary depending on the version of Office that you have installed on your machine. That's going to be based on, like I said, whether it's 64-bit or 32-bit. So it could be the program files or the program files x86 folder. And then also the version. It might say Office 16, 15, 14, 12, however far back your Office goes, there will be a folder in there for it. One way to find that folder easily is if you go into the Windows Explorer and you search for your eurotool.xlam file. That is something that whenever you install Excel, Microsoft should have that provided in the folder, the library folder already. So if you find that file, then the XLA file is going to go in that exact same folder. So sometimes if I can't find it, that's how I search for it that way. But the typical folder location is going to be here: C drive, program files, or program files x86, Microsoft Office, Office version, root, library. So essentially you're just looking for that library folder. And once you find it, that's where the XLA file should go. So once the file is placed, you can go ahead and start running your spreadsheet imports. That's all that's required. Sometimes though, there are going to be a couple errors that kind of run along with that. The most common one you'll run into is that it says it can't find the macro file, that it's either missing or you've misplaced it in the wrong folder. So just make sure that you've found the correct library folder. Sometimes there's two, depending on the version, and that there's only one version of your XLA file available. If you have multiple versions of the file in different folders, sometimes the spreadsheet importer will try to go to the wrong folder, find that file, and then it doesn't run properly. So delete every version of the XLA file except for the one that you've got in your library folder. In other situations, you may run into connection issues. You try to run the spreadsheet import and then either times out or it says that it can't connect to the database. Typically that is due to the wrong file version. most commonly is whenever you update your GeoGraphix to a new version of the software from 2016 to 2017, 2017 to 2019, whatever it might be, and you have the leftover macro file from the previous version. Whenever you run that importer tool, it'll go out and find the wrong one. So you want to make sure that you grab the right one from the utilities folder that you've downloaded for the version of the software that you have. And then once you replace it with the new version of the file, then that should fix that. Another common one that we run into is a toolbar automation error. As you can see, a little screenshot of it down here at the bottom. It may also say toolbar error, application defined, or object defined error. This message is, you can safely ignore it. You can still run the GeoGraphix spreadsheet importer. It means that the little icon for running the spreadsheet importer, the transfer button, is invisible, but you can still click on it and run it. So this one's kind of sporadic. You may see it one time and then you go to run another import afterwards and then it works. Basically, it just means that the little logo, the picture, can't be found, and so it just doesn't display it. But you can still click on it, you can still run it, everything works. So typically you can kind of ignore that if you see that message pop up. And I'll show you kind of where the button is. It's always in the same location, it'll never move. So as long as you're aware of where it is, you'll still be able to use the tool, no problem. To actually run the spreadsheet import, the two methods of doing that, the most common one is the obvious method. That's through your file import options, either through Wellbase or through Product Explorer. You can go to File, Import, and then you'll have the option for Spreadsheet. That's going to be running those imports. If you run it through Wellbase, it'll automatically connect to the Wellbase database and you can run the import that way. If you run it through Product Explorer, you'll get another window prompt that's asking if you want to import this data to Wellbase, if you want to import it into LeaseMap, if you want to import it into SizeBase. You have three options for importing spreadsheet data. So just make sure you choose the correct place that you're trying to import your data. Most cases it will be Wellbase. The other option is going through the kind of the back end through Excel itself. This is either in cases where it's not working correctly, going through the normal import methods, the file import spreadsheet, or you've already got your spreadsheet open and you just want to go ahead and run the importer right from there. This can be run through the file options. Once you get that options window open, then there's going to be an Addins tab to the left. You just click on that. And then down at the bottom of that window, there's a Go button, and you click on that. And then from there will be a checkbox for the GeoGraphix spreadsheet transaction. Once you check that box, excuse me, again, it'll prompt you for, is this going to be Wellbase, LeaseMap, or SizeBase? Choose the one you want to import the data for, and it'll activate the add-ins. We'll go through an example of that, kind of showing kind of what that looks like and how to get there. I'll show you guys an example here in just a second. For activating through the other method. Whenever you map out your spreadsheet, each table in Wellbase can be imported into. That's going to be your header, your formation tops, your production data, your surveys, your DST, IP, perforation, completion data, core data, tubing, casing information. Pretty much anything that you see there inside of Wellbase you can import into, the exception being zone data. Zone Manager has its own import. You can import multiple tables at once. So if you have a spreadsheet with multiple sheets within it, each one of those can be imported into fairly easily. You can just map out, say I'm importing 6 sheets all together, and we'll show an example of that here. You just check all 6 boxes and it'll run all the imports together. As I kind of mentioned previously, some tables require data to already be present. The most common ones for that are going to be your core data and your perforation data. If you ever tried to run a spreadsheet import for core and it doesn't come in, it's because you're missing some core header information. Same for perforations. If you try to import perf data, you have to have completion header information in there first. I'll kind of show you where you can check that in Wellbase and also whenever you do the spreadsheet import. And the last thing is anything that you're looking for to import from a spreadsheet, you have to make sure that all the required fields are mapped out with that spreadsheet. If you miss one or don't have it mapped out correctly, the import will not run. So just check for the required fields. They'll have an asterisk next to them when you're mapping out your columns. And again, I'll kind of show those as we go through here, and make sure all of those are filled out. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a spreadsheet here, and we'll go ahead and run that that import. That's okay. Oops, that's the PowerPoint demo sheet. Okay, so this is a example spreadsheet that I've already got set up here. Couple of different types of data that I'm going to be bringing in here. Along the bottom, you'll see there's multiple different sheets included in the spreadsheet. Like I said, I got 6 here. Header data for a handful of wells here. Some core data that I've got here. This is the core header, and then the actual core data itself. Some location information, some production data, and some survey data. Typically, when you have your spreadsheet, you're going to have a header row and then the actual data within the spreadsheet. And then once you start to activate the add-ins and run the import, you'll see the yellow bar along the top. I've saved the spreadsheet with the yellow bar already available. However, it's not currently active. So what we'll need to do is we're going to activate the yellow bar, the add-ins, and we're going to do that by using that kind of back-end method through Excel as opposed to the file import option through Wellbase or through Product Explorer. And I'm going to import all of this type of all this data together here: header, core data, location, production, and survey all at once. So to activate that the macro file, I said you go up here to File. Once you go to File, then over on your left-hand side, you're going to see the options down here at the bottom. Go ahead and click on that. With the Excel options, then you'll see the window here. Down towards the bottom on the left-hand side is your Add-ins option. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Add-ins. And this add-ins is going to give you a list of all the available add-ins that Excel has. Some of these will be pre-set up through Microsoft Office already. They're pre-installed. Others are going to be things that maybe you've added yourself. And the most common one, or most important one that we're looking at here in this case, is your GeoGraphix spreadsheet transaction. So all you need to do is just highlight add-ins, and then down here at the bottom, we want to manage those add-ins. So I'm going to click on Go. I don't need to highlight the spreadsheet transaction or anything else. I just need to hit Go. That'll give you a little dialog box with a couple of checkboxes. Those checkboxes are going to be, okay, which of these macros do you want to enable and activate? So I'm just going to activate my spreadsheet transaction from GeoGraphix. Check that box on, and then click OK. So then you'll get the Start Application Macro, little prompt window here. Sometimes this does appear behind your spreadsheet, so if you don't see it appear immediately, then you can go to your Task Manager and then go under Microsoft Excel and then look for the Start Application Macro window there, and you just double click on it and it'll bring it to the front. So if you ever think that your spreadsheet's hanging, it might actually just be hiding that little tool behind the screens or behind your spreadsheet. So you just need to bring it forward, and then that'll enable it. As I mentioned, you can import into Wellbase, LeaseMap, and SizeBase. Each one will have different table options to import into. So just make sure you grab the correct one for the type of data you're bringing into. LeaseMap for your lease data, SizeBase for your 2D shot point seismic information. So I got Wellbase selected there. So that'll just take a moment to connect out to my database and enable the add-ins application. As I mentioned before, sometimes you will get this error message. As I was kind of run through a couple tests, I got this about 50% of the time. So it's kind of a good example here. You simply click OK on it. The button still works. I'll show you where it is and that it's just simply invisible. You can still do all your work even though that shows up. So along the top here, You'll now see that there's a new menu option for add-ins. We'll go ahead and click on that. And I've already got this spreadsheet set up from some previous imports. Some of these, as you save them, you can save your table information up here at the top. Be kind of careful with that though, because if you do add new spreadsheet pages down here at the bottom, depending on where that gets added into, it'll shift everything over. So for instance, if I was to add a new sheet, then everything I have mapped out for core header gets transferred over to whatever the second page is. So sometimes, like I said, if you're going to be adding more and more pages, just be careful where you add them and be aware that you may have to map some things differently because the mapping gets transferred with the sheet number. So with the add-ins, there's kind of two things you'll need to pay attention to whenever you're first kind of setting this up. The first one is, which table are you going to be importing data into? So I've named these down at the bottom of each table that it's going into. Sometimes you may not always have that. So the first one is going to be header. I want to make sure I have my header data. I must have header information to bring in the well ID, to bring in the well itself. After that, everything else can kind of go in and connect to that the well ID if it's not already in the project. So the table options are going to be chosen from here in the top drop down. So it's going to be your header, your perfs, your survey, your production data, your formation tops, tubing, casing, DST information, core information. Pretty much, again, every table as it's found inside of Wellbase, you can find somewhere from here. So like I said, I got this one mapped out for header. The other thing to pay attention to is this second checkbox, and that is this number. This number here refers to where the data actually starts in the spreadsheet. So it's set to 3, meaning that the third row in your spreadsheet is where the data actually starts. First row is the yellow add-ins toolbar. Second row is my header. Third row is where the first well and the rest of the data starts. If you don't have a header row, then just make sure you go back and change that to 2. Again, you can't set it to 1 because that yellow add-ins bar is always going to take up the first row, and it just shifts everything else down. So if you have more header rows, a lot of other information you want to skip, you can come up here and adjust that to be anything else. It goes to 20, but you can type in another value if it goes beyond that. So just be aware that to double check that and make sure you got it on the correct row. Otherwise, it'll start bringing in some data you didn't really want it to. You can create a well called UWI if you're not careful in this case. After that, then you can start mapping out all the information for the header table. So this is going to be information that I want to bring into the scout ticket. The well ID, the well name, the well number, TD, operator status, all that information, its lat long location, all that information is going to be header data. If the spreadsheet has any data that you don't want to bring in, that you want to skip during an import, you just simply don't map it out. For instance, here I have a bottom hole latitude and a bottom hole longitude. That's not included in the header. That's more useful for something in the survey data, so I just simply don't map it out. You don't have to delete it, you don't have to clean it up completely. You just leave it there and you don't map it and it won't be imported. So I've got this mapped out here for everything that I want to bring in. As I mentioned, each table has its own required fields. Whenever you right-click in the yellow bar above a column, that's going to say, okay, what is this going to be mapped out to? And in that drop-down box, you'll see everything that's available for header. So again, that's all the fields that are available in the header table. Anything with that asterisk, in this case, well ID is the only required field for header data. Anything with that asterisk has to be mapped out in order for the spreadsheet to run the import. If you miss one, then that data doesn't get transferred into the database, or it just doesn't get imported correctly. So just make sure that you've got everything that has an asterisk. Excuse me. And again, each table has its own required fields. I'll kind of look at a couple others as I go through here real quick. So I got this mapped out, everything that I want to bring in. I'm going to go over to core header. So I mentioned with the core data and your completion and perforation data, it requires some data to already be present in the project in order for it to be brought in. So say, for instance, you have some porosity values for some core data. For example, just some random values I've kind of got set up here for this one well. If you want to bring in those porosity values, and this is what the spreadsheet import would look like for that, you have to have a core ID or a core header value populated first. If you look in Wellbase, go over to the core tab. In the core tab, there's kind of two things that are two different tables, quote unquote, as kind of how this is broken out into, even though it's one tab. That's going to be the core header up here at the top. That's core number, top depth, base depth, core type, everything else you see there. And then down at the bottom is your actual core analysis, the values that are associated with that particular core number. So that's where your porosity, your permeability, and any of your user fields all go to whenever you run that. So you have to have something filled out here first, that core number at least, before you can import anything down here at the bottom. If you do not have a value here, then the import will not run. Or it'll run, but no data will come through. So make sure that either A, you just come in here and you type in whatever you want the number to be. You just simply type in a 1 and that should be it. You don't need to have a spreadsheet specific for it. Or your spreadsheet has a core header page. In this case, again, all you need is the well ID and what we call the core number, or as I've called it, the core observation. So again, if I look at core, you'll see core ID and core number are required. They both have an asterisk next to them. And when you look in your drop-down menu for the table you want to import to, there's core, that's the core header, and then core analysis, just the actual data that goes with it. All right, so I've got that one mapped out, got the well and its core number. Go look at the core data. So again, this is the core analysis. You'll see I've got that selected up here at the top now, core analysis. And I got the well ID, my sample numbers, and then the corresponding core ID that's going to. If you've got multiple core IDs available for that well, some of these values might go to the first one, some might go to the second one, the third one, so on. And it's kind of broken out that way. And then after that, my porosity values that I'm bringing in for that particular well. So just a couple random numbers there. So that one's set up and good to go. Go over here to my location data. This is, again, some information that goes with the header, section, township, range information. With this one, there is a required field for what we call a bottom hole flag. That basically just indicates, is this location information for a surface hole or a bottom hole? If it's a surface hole, it's a value of 0. If it's a bottom hole, it's a value of 1. So that's a required field that we include in there. So simply, if you don't have that in your spreadsheet already, whenever you're importing location data, if I remember correctly, I think it's only location Congress, but it might be some of the other ones. Then simply just put a column in there for bottom hole flag and either give it a 0 or 1, depending on if it's surface or bottom hole. Production data. Production data has 3 required fields. That's going to be your well ID, your date of production, and then the zone that is the producing zone for that particular well. And again, you'll see the asterisks there for those: date, well ID, and zone. For pretty much every spreadsheet import that you do, well ID is going to be a required field for pretty much anything that you're importing. So make sure you always include the well ID with that information. Last one here is survey. Well ID, MD, inclination, azimuth, and survey point information. The required fields in this case are my well ID and the measured depth. So those are the 2 things that you have to have mapped out in order for the survey to calculate. Technically, you don't even need the inclination and azimuth information because you can base the survey on bottom hole offsets, or you can base it on bottom hole location data, and you just have depth information. Various calculation methods need various kinds of data. Of course, inclination and azimuth get you the best or the more detailed survey so that it looks a little bit cleaner. So we have that in there. So that's all the data that I've got for this spreadsheet. Everything is mapped out the way I need it. One quick aside, whenever you are importing your spreadsheets, as I mentioned, you kind of have to separate these out into separate sheets. I can't have all this data on one sheet because as I'm mapping this out, I can only map out one type of data per sheet. So for this one, it's all header data. This one, it's all core header. If I was to say, okay, I mapped out my core data, and then I had more data here, and I say, okay, now I want to do survey data with this one. Whenever you do that, it'll say this is mapped out to the core table. If you change it to a different one, it'll remove these mappings and you'll have to kind of start over again. So you can say yes and it'll clear this, or you can say no and leave it at core. So that's why we have to break these out into separate sheets and do multiple different kind of import options, as opposed to putting it all into one sheet and importing to multiple tables. Technically you can do that, but you have to do the import multiple times. Map it out once for header, then map it out for survey, then something else, and kind of just run an import, change the mapping, run an import, change the mapping. So this method is a little bit cleaner for managing that. So once everything is mapped, I got all the data that I want to import into my project. Along the top, you got your header. Data starts in the third row. Last button here, again, invisible because of that error, the transfer to GeoGraphix button. It's still there, you can click on it. The icon just isn't present. Whenever you click on that, it's going to go ahead and read all the sheets you have mapped out, check the database for the various tables that are available, and then we'll go ahead and start mapping that out. So that's header, monthly production, survey data, location congress, and then core and core analysis. Those are the 6 pages that I have mapped out here, so I want to make sure I check all 6 of those. I'm going to go ahead and allow updates for any existing wells. All these are new wells, so I don't necessarily need to check that box, but if you're updating a well that's already in your database, make sure that you check that box. If you don't, then it's going to say, oh, there's already this well, you're not letting this update those existing wells, so it may not import the data correctly. I'm in a US-based project, so it's the English measurement system. For any Canadian-based projects or other projects outside of the US, you might want to make sure you have that set to metric. And the last thing is your coordinate system of the data being brought in. You just want to make sure that you double check that it matches what you already have in the project. So under select coordinate system, this is set to my project, geolat long nad 27. That's the data that I'm bringing in. Lat longs are in a latitude and longitude as opposed to XY coordinates. If that's different, if your data that you're bringing in doesn't match what's ever in the database, make sure you change your coordinate system to something that matches. All right, so all that is mapped out and good to go. So you'll just click OK and then let the spreadsheet run. Once it goes through and it reads all the data in the table and checks all the information, the import should complete. And then Wellbase will update. Sometimes if there's any issues with the data that you're importing, you'll get a little log file indicating that there's some problems with the spreadsheet. And you can open that up in a little file there. It'll tell you what row that the problem is and then which table it's a part of. So in this case, it looks like I've got some problems with my monthly production data. And it'll typically kind of tell you what that error is. Sometimes it's a little not super helpful. It just says there's an SQL anywhere error. But typically you can go in there and look into those tables and kind of find the issue. Common ones are going to be there's a comma in the data. If there's a comma, then it reads that as a delimiter and it kind of messes up the data. So to make sure there's no commas in your numbers that you bring in. Other common ones are going to be syntax errors where there's other illegal characters, say like a well name or something like that. Common ones being, again, commas. I think generally periods are okay in those. Single quotes, double quotes, percent signs, stuff like that. You want to try and avoid those whenever you bring that data in. It'll give you an error. So yeah, you can go and check that various table, go to that row and just look at the data and make sure nothing looks wrong. Sometimes even though it tells you that there's an error, some of the data will still come in. So just make sure you double check some of that information. All right, so I'm going to go over to Wellbase here. And in Wellbase, I've got these new wells included here now, as well as up here at the top, the 250 wells. And I can see that there's data that was imported in from there. Got some header data, my location information, some again, header information down here at the bottom, some production data that was brought in from there. And also for that first well, my core data. So again, core number was brought in, as well as the actual core analysis. My 8 sample numbers with the porosity values. So all that data was brought in successfully. couple other things with the spreadsheet importer, again, as I kind of mentioned, checking the various required fields, and that if there's other tables that rely on a previous table. Core is the core header that's required for core analysis. Completion is the table that's required for, I don't have an example of person here right now, but I'll just kind of show it real quick. Completion is the one that's required for perforation data. You have to have completion header before you can bring in perfs. So with completion, it's essentially going to be a well ID, again, as always, and what we call an observation number. That observation number refers to your completion ID number up here at the top, just where it says number. That's your observation. So make sure that there's a value in there first. So once you bring that in from the import, your observation number, then you can bring in your perf data. So switch this over to perfs real quick. So with the perfs, again, as always, well ID, and there's completion observation number and observation number. Completion observation number refers back to that number that's in the header, that information you have along the top. Observation number after that is going to refer down here to your perforation ID numbers. So you'll need to go ahead and fill those out as well. That's a required field. Have to have that ID number in there. And then just make sure it corresponds to the correct completion ID number that you bring in from the previous import. So that's the other common one. That's a common gotcha with those spreadsheets. People try to import their perfs, but it won't come in because you have to have that completion data in there first. Okay, so that's the kind of the import data there with the spreadsheet. Yeah, so just whenever you're importing your data and you're mapping data out, again, just double check the things to make sure that you've got all the required fields. A lot of the ones sometimes will have data you're not expecting in there in order for it to be mapped out. Common one is going to be with like formation tops. You have to include an observation number with formation tops. And whenever you get that data from vendors, they typically don't always include that. So you'll need to include a column for observation number. And again, typically that can just be a 1, or if a well has 2 picks for the same top, 1 and a 2, depending on how that's set up. All right. So that is kind of an example there of the spreadsheet importer, kind of some of the common errors. So there's various other errors that are involved with that as well that sometimes are a bit more involved in kind of some of the steps that need to be taken to fix it. For those, you can either contact us here at support, or you can check on the support portal. We do have a couple of, I believe some of the solutions up there include the steps that need to be taken. Again, one of the more common ones that I see is that there's a missing DLL file. We provide, I think in one of the solutions, a link that shows you where to go and find that DLL file. But again, if you ever just want to make sure you're doing it correctly or you need some help doing it, you can contact us at support to help out with that. So I said, I can't go through every single error because they vary from machine to machine, but those are the common ones. And then just an example of that spreadsheet and kind of how it's mapped out.